The idea had crept into a quiet corner of Tu's thoughts during the family's first meal with O'Connor. He saw the way O'Connor looked at his daughter and wondered if an opportunity lay there. Mere was uncomfortable with O'Connor from the moment he arrived. She didn't like how he called her Miss Mary, or how her brothers laughed at his jokes. She didn't like the way he easily diffused her father's short temper. The man was just too clever. By the time her father moved O'Connor up to the house, Mere had learnt to build avoidance of him into her routine. Te kaha continued to grow strong and clever. He went everywhere with Mere, and she let him explore the world around her feet while she worked. She relied on listening for him as she worked. His gurgles and soft off-key humming signalled his whereabouts. One day, it was only a few seconds of total silence that meant something had changed in the air beyond Mere's sight. She listened hard, then moved swiftly. She found Te kaha holding a large daisy half crushed in his right fist, his eyes and mouth open wide. Crawling along his hand was a fat bee. Mere wasn't sure what to do. Then she saw that they were not alone. O'Connor stood a few feet away, watching the scene. Slowly he crouched, then moved forward and began singing a little rhyme in a soft, low voice. The song caught the baby's attention. He grinned and reached both arms towards O'Connor. The bee took flight. Te kaha then crawled to O'Connor. It was so unusual for Mere to see her son shown affection by one of the men in the house. She could feel herself being charmed by this man, who already had everyone else under his spell. She wanted to resist, but it was too good to see the joy on her son's face. For the first time, Mere looked him properly in the eye and nodded her thanks. Later, alone in the quietness of the sleeping house, she remembered what it was like to look into O'Connor's eyes properly and find kindness there.
The house looked bad outside, with peeled paint and old furniture and rubbish scattered everywhere. But that was nothing compared to inside. It was grimy, really deep filth. Lula couldn't see it so much as feel it. Dusk had fallen very quickly, and they would need to make a space for themselves in the mess, sanitize a patch to eat and sleep in. For now, there was electricity and running water. Biggs was so silent it was like he was yelling in her ears. She registered the boxes stacked neatly on the back porch, all the supplies they had shipped in advance, food, cleaning gear, equipment. On top was a bunch of lavender tied with a note. "Welcome to the neighbourhood." It didn't say who it was from. Lula woke with the first light. Biggs snored a few metres away in his sleeping bag. Day one. She'd barely slept, plagued by strange thoughts and dreams. Something bad had happened here. Someone had died, or there'd been a violence of some kind. In the dreams, there were things that felt as if they didn't belong in her mind. Malevolent male figures, grey, two-dimensional and thin like muslin, slashing each other and bleeding. The fight was theirs, but they glared at her as if she should be doing something about it. In the daylight, the dreams seemed ridiculous, but the guilt, the fear, the anger at being accused unfairly stayed with her. She walked the perimeter of the property, noting there was no birdsong. When she got back to the house, Biggs was up. They donned rubber gloves, filled buckets with disinfectant, and got to work. The week progressed like that. Under the grime, they found that, indeed, the house did have good bones. Biggs slept deeply each night. He ate heartily, sang while he worked, and remained in good spirits almost constantly. The only time Lula noticed any cracks in his demeanour was at night, when he would talk about Jen and Fitty incessantly. After 3 days, Biggs announced he couldn't wait much longer to phone Jen. They needed to go to town and find a public phone. Tomorrow, he said, after the morning's work. Lula was relieved. She needed to get away from the house. Biggs was preparing to strip the bedrooms of their manky floor coverings. Lula had one more bedroom to clear out before he could finish. Something caught her eye. Words and designs scrawled in childish writing on the inner wall of a closet. A heart with an arrow through it. A koru design and the words love, hate, and tui. Something in Lula's belly flipped. It was no longer easy to breathe. It couldn't be her mother's writing. She hadn't been here. She couldn't have been here. Who was Tui, then? A coincidence. Surely. It was enough to shake her, though the idea of some kid being stuck in a closet long enough to write all that. Biggs' singing had stopped. Lula's voice was shaky. Come and see this. Biggs crouched in the closet and looked for a long time. Lula could tell by how quiet he was. It worried him too. She gave him a shove. Let's get out of this house for a bit. Meet some locals. It took an hour and a half to drive back to the main town, Waitangi. A couple of general stores, a petrol station, a pub, and a museum. One or two people stopped to look in their direction, and Lula felt it register. Stranger. She looked away. They parked on a slope above the hotel and walked down to the beach below. It was strewn with tyres, old iron drums and nets, plastic bottles, even the odd toy. It could have been a tropical beach. The sand was gold. The teal waters lapped in and out lazily. Underneath the detritus, it was paradise. But no one was around. In the hotel, they had to withstand the initial discomfort of a dozen pair of eyes sizing them up. And then they had to tell their story, why they were there, where they were staying, what they wanted for lunch. 2 massive plates of blue cod appeared, with fresh salad and potatoes. Neither of them spoke for the time it took to demolish every morsel. That was good, Leila told the barman as they got ready to pay. We haven't eaten anything fresh for a couple of days. Know where we can get some kaimoana? The barman laughed. Kaimoana is what we do. Just got to meet the right people. Who's up your way? Molly Te Pākari. She lives right next door, doesn't she? You're in that house with the old washed-out driveway, yeah? Well, Molly TP is straight over the hill. Queen of the Weka hunt. Lives almost entirely off what she can find in the sea and bush. She'll put you right. While Biggs phoned home, Lula looked around the village and brought some supplies from the general store. Biggs was quieter when he returned. It's hard, he said. I should be with Jen and Fitzy. We got to get this sorted out ASAP so I can go home. Lula understood. But it made her feel more alone, more isolated. Biggs would leave when his work was done, and she would stay on for another week in the house.
Where the Re Kohu Bone Sings by Tina Makereti, published by Random House and adapted for radio by Owen Scott, episode 11 on Monday. Some feedback coming in after our interview at 10 with Dara McNulty on his Diary of a Young Naturalist. Thanks for a fascinating talk with Dara. As a mum of an autistic daughter, it's great to hear him talk about some of the difficulties living life as an autistic teen, yet so positive about life in general. And another listener says, I have twin boys who are very similar and will be listening to this with them when they get home from school. Thank you. Another one, thanks for the great interview on autism. Hopefully it will give more understanding of these issues for those who don't suffer in this way, and comfort for those who do that they aren't alone. It's no fun to have these problems. Thank you so much for your feedback. After the news, Grant Smithies is here with a reissued version of Straight Jacket Fits LP Hail, and sports commentator Dana Johansson too.
RNZ News at 11. Good morning. I'm Nicola Wright.
Good morning, everybody. Today we're releasing the findings of the government inquiry held into Operation Burnham and related events. The report, delivered to me on the 17th of July, examined the operation that took place on 21-22 August 2010 in Turgaran Valley, Afghanistan. It was sorry, could I have a glass of water? I'm just good. Thank you. Just run up the stairs, sorry. So the report was delivered to me on July 17 and it examined the operation that took place on 21-22 August 2010 in Turgaran Valley, Afghanistan. It was an operation carried out by New Zealand Special Air Service, the NZSAS troops, and other nations' forces operating as part of the International Security Assistance Force. It was the subject of the book Hit and Run by authors Nikki Hager and John Stevenson, which contained a number of serious allegations. Bearing in mind the need for the public to have confidence in the NZDF, the government decided that it was in the public interest to hold an inquiry. The findings of this report show that it was the right thing to do. Today we're releasing the report in full, demonstrating our commitment to transparency. The independent inquiry, which began in April 2018, was undertaken by two people of the highest repute, former Supreme Court Judge Sir Terence Arnold and Sir Geoffrey Palmer, both top quality legal minds. The inquiry found that the actions of the NZAS on the ground during Operation Burnham were both professional and lawful. There were insurgents present, which the book had denied. However, there were significant shortcomings in the way the NZDF subsequently dealt with the allegations of civilian casualties. And this resulted in a series of incorrect statements in briefings to ministers and public statements for 7 years between 2010 and 2017. The inquiry also considered that the way a prisoner was treated and handled showed New Zealand's detention policy was inappropriate and did not reflect New Zealand's values. I will mention some specific conclusions the inquiry reached which relate to allegations and events covered by the book. First, it concluded that all actions by NZSAS personnel during Operations Burnham and Nova, a return operation to some of the villages, complied with the rules of engagement and international humanitarian law. They were legitimate operations and they were not carried out as revenge attacks. It is likely that a female child, but not the girl Fatima described in the book, died as a result of the operation. But NZSAS personnel had a proper basis for clearing the engagement in which she was most likely killed. At least 7 men were killed in the operation. 3 were identified as insurgents in subsequent intelligence reports. There is evidence linking 2 more to the insurgent group, but no firm conclusion was reached by the inquiry. The inquiry was unable to determine whether 2 others were insurgents or civilians. In the case of one of these last 2 mentioned, a New Zealand soldier fired the shots. The report finds this killing was in accordance with the rules of engagement and the principles of international humanitarian law applicable to non-international armed conflict. At least 6 civilians were injured. On the matter of a cover-up raised by the book, an incident assessment team appointed by the NATO-led International Security Assistance Force that undertook a preliminary investigation immediately after the operation concluded it was possible that civilian casualties had occurred when several buildings were struck by fire from a misaligned weapon on one of the helicopters. While there was no organised institutional strategy to cover up civilian casualties, between 2010 and 2017, the New Zealand Defence Force made a series of incorrect and misleading statements in briefing to ministers and in public statements. Those were to the effect that the allegations of civilian casualties had been investigated and found to be baseless or unfounded. The inquiry concluded that a senior SAS officer deployed in Afghanistan, not one of the people there on the night, but at head office, if you like, in Afghanistan, displayed an inexcusable lack of care and rigour in misrepresenting the findings of the incident assessment team investigation into allegations of civilian casualties. That communication was then accepted without question by his superiors, despite being contradicted by other information available to NZDF, including video footage, intelligence reporting, and ISAF's own media releases. NZDF subsequently failed to adequately remedy its earlier incorrect statements and advice, even after it knew they were wrong. NZDF continued to repeat its incorrect statements, both publicly and to ministers, due to failures of organisational structure, systems and culture. NZDF personnel edited out of reports from Afghanistan that there may have been civilian casualties. NZDF's failure to provide full, timely and accurate information to ministers undermined 2 fundamental principles of our democracy: civilian control of the military and ministerial accountability to Parliament. I consider this to be one of the most concerning conclusions of the inquiry. Returning to the matter of information provided about the possibility of civilian casualties, Dr. Wayne Mapp, then Minister of Defence, was misled between Operation Burnham in August 2010 and September 2011 as to the possibility of civilian casualties. His statements until September 2011 were understandably based on that misinformation. From September 2011 onwards, former Defence Minister Wayne Mapp failed to correct the public record and continued the false narrative that the incident assessment team had found there were no casualties, even though he had been briefed at that point and knew its true conclusion was that civilian casualties were possible. Following this briefing, he gave answers he ought to have known were wrong to journalists, and in the words of the inquiry, this was a significant departure from the standards expected of ministers. The collateral damage program on Maori TV caused the then Minister of Defence, Jonathan Coleman, to investigate further. He handled himself well. NZDF did not. The inquiry said that the events in 2014 showed a surprising level of ineptitude and disorganisation within NZDF headquarters. Moving to other areas examined by the inquiry. NZDF's rules of engagement did authorise targeted killings, that is, the predetermined and offensive use of lethal force against specified individuals, provided the individual was directly participating in hostilities. These matters were apparent to NZDF, the Minister of Defence and the Prime Minister during the 2009-2012 period. The book Hit and Run also raised questions about the treatment and handling of insurgent Kari Mirage. The inquiry concluded he was punched around the rib or stomach area by a member of the NZ SAS when he was detained. The assault was not as serious as portrayed in the book, but in saying that, I am in no way attempting to downplay it. Any assault in these circumstances is unacceptable. Further, despite strong evidence that Mirage was tortured after he was placed into Afghan custody, senior leaders in the military and ministers were not briefed, nor were any further steps taken. The inquiry made 4 recommendations. Firstly, that an expert review group should look into NZDF's organisational structure, record keeping and retrieval processes to ensure the Minister of Defence that they meet international best practice. Secondly, that the Office of an Independent Inspector General of Defence, located outside the NZDF organisational structure, should be established to facilitate independent oversight of the NZDF so as to enhance its democratic accountability. Thirdly, a defence order shall be promulgated setting out how allegations of civilian casualties should be dealt with in theatre and in New Zealand. And lastly, the government should set effective detention policies and procedures in relation to people detained by or with the involvement of New Zealand forces overseas, and how allegations of torture by such persons are treated. The government thanks the inquiry for the report and accepts in principle all 4 recommendations and will undertake work to progress them. Finally, I want to sum up my comments by drawing on the concluding observations made in the inquiry report. It noted that the book Hit and Run contained many errors and wrongly impugned the integrity and professionalism of the NZ personnel on the ground in Operation Burnham on the night in question. Despite that, the inquiry report says that in important aspects the book was right. It is likely that a child was killed in Operation Burnham. Some civilians were injured. An SAS troop did punch Kari Mirage. The evidence indicates he was then tortured in the Afghan National Directorate of Security Detention Facility, and the report finds that New Zealand did breach its obligations to him. The inquiry also finds that NZDF did give erroneous information to ministers and the public about the allegations of civilian casualties over a number of years. Without the book, the findings of the report and its important recommendations would not have been possible. Given this, it is right to acknowledge, as the report does, that the book has performed a valuable public service. I'm happy to take your questions. Well, in my answers, I'm going to endeavour to use the words of the inquiry rather than cast my own opinion over them, because the words of the inquiry are telling. The inquiry goes through how a number of individuals within the New Zealand Defence Force, not at the most senior level, but not the people operational on the ground, made terrible mistakes. And the inquiry concluded that the failures were not simply failures on the part of individuals, nor are they simply failures of organisational structure or systems, and I'm quoting from a report. They're also failures of culture. The culture within NZDF was not fully accepting of the constraints and disciplines inherent in those fundamental principles. They say that it is indisputable that NZDF's response was woeful, and their last sentence in their report says how the New Zealand Defence Force addresses its failings and goes forward will reveal its true character and the strength of its purpose.
It says that they've edited out reports. I mean, how is that not covered?
The inquiry did not say that the editing of those reports by those that did that wasn't attempting to cover things up. What it said was that there wasn't a plot, if you like, within New Zealand Defence Force as a whole, including its senior levels, to cover up. In respect of the issues that you ask about the editing of that report, on pages 258 to 259, that is detailed by the inquiry, and it says what it says is that Lieutenant Colonel Parsons initially made an error when he was looking at the report, but not looking at that report in detail. And in respect of that error, they said, on any view, the way he interpreted and reported on the paragraph in question was unreasonable and unacceptable. It then goes on, though, to say that when another report was being prepared in Afghanistan pointing out the possibility of civilian casualties, Lieutenant Colonel Parsons did direct the officer in charge to change his situation report to remove references to the possibility that the air assets had caused civilian casualties. And in respect of that section of the report, it concludes, on any view, what happened was inexcusable, especially as it resulted in the New Zealand Defence Force giving erroneous information to the Chief of Defence Force and to ministers, and through them to Parliament and to the public over the ensuing years.
What would be quite jarring for a lot of New Zealanders is seeing the likelihood of a young girl being killed, being in this inquiry. What's the government's response to that?
I think the government's response, as the prior government's response, would have been one of sadness, that a young girl, completely innocent, would be killed as a consequence of being caught up in a legitimate military exercise.
Is it acceptable?
Well, it was legal. It, of course, is undesirable. And I'm sure that everyone that was involved in that, including those that were involved in this operation on the night, who were there at the command of their officers and the New Zealand government, would regret that too.
Did the inquiry at all feel misled by any members of the Defence Force that gave evidence?
I would reply by saying that the inquiry did not accept the explanations of some of the witnesses.
But not necessarily like to.
I would prefer to stick to the wording of the inquiry. The purpose of the inquiry wasn't to find whether there should be any consequence for those individuals. That's a separate matter. But it did find that it didn't accept some of the explanations as to the handling of documents, for example.
Do you expect there will be consequences now for some of those individuals?
Well, that's a matter for the New Zealand Defence Force, and I can't answer that question. But I do repeat that how the New Zealand Defence Force addresses its failings and goes forward will reveal its true character and strength of its purpose.
Do you think the public and ministers can have confidence in the Defence Force after reading this report?
I think, well, we still have confidence in the current Chief of Defence, Head of Defence, and the armed forces for whom he is responsible. But it's also correct that the report said in respect of events, 3 years after Operation Burnham, in respect of events in June and July 2014, and this is another quote, they showed a surprising level of ineptitude and disorganisation within NZDF headquarters.
Right, so do you think a number of changes need to be made for the public and the government to be able to, I guess, have full trust in the Defence Force?
To have full confidence in them, yes, and that's why we accept the recommendations in respect of document storage and retrieval systems. One of the problems here was that even when documents were eventually transferred back to New Zealand that included the references to the possibility of civilian casualties, they weren't stored in the right place and they weren't properly drawn to the attention of the most senior people in the New Zealand Defence Force or their ministerial leaders at the times they should have been.
Does the recommendation go far enough to avoid one of the main takeaways from this, which is that senior theatre commanders were, through their actions and inactions, misleading their superiors in Wellington?
Oh, I think that's been made clear by the inquiry. The inquiry has shed light on that. It would not have come to light had we not had this inquiry. We're very confident we've done the right thing to shine light upon this, and we expect through the recommendations that have been made, those issues will be adequately addressed.
Has anything changed, though, over the past 7 years that would stop that situation from taking place again today?
Well, the inquiry didn't look at the events outside of Operation Burnham, so they weren't in a position to make that conclusion. But if they were of the view that everything was all in tickety-boo, they wouldn't have made the recommendations that they've had. So I think they believe that there is more work needs to be done there, and we agree with that.
Did the government lack appropriate sort of civilian control and oversight of the military at this time?
Yes, that's essentially what this report finds, is that because of the failures to properly pass information through to the senior leaders of the New Zealand Defence Force and through to the ministers therefore did not have the information they were entitled to, and therefore they could not respond to either the public through Parliament or other members of Parliament through Parliament or to the media. So that is the most serious finding in this report, that during those years, as a consequence of the ineptitude of the suppression of documents that should have been coming to ministers were not able to exercise the democratic control of the military. The military do not exist for their own purpose. They are meant to be controlled by their minister, who is accountable to Parliament.
But to be clear, you don't think that the military was out of control or had positioned itself so it was in that space?
No, I don't think so, no.
It was ineptitude.
Well, there was, yes, as I've already read, at times, according to the inquiry, surprising levels of ineptitude and disorganisation were displayed within NZDF headquarters.
So that would make it sound like the government didn't have control of the military, and the military also in a way didn't have control of itself. Would that not be a fair assessment?
That's true, at least in part, yes.
In regards to the recommendations, when will government start work on implementing those?
Immediately. We've, as a cabinet, adopted those 4 recommendations in principle. Some of them are simpler to implement than others. We do need to give some thought as to the oversight Inspector General that's recommended, likely to be modelled on the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security that we already have, the IGIS. But there are thought needs to be given where that person's located, what their roles and responsibilities are.
Are you expecting the Defence Force to be open to that, having an independent watchdog?
Well, it's not their choice.
Just back onto consequences. Everyone who gave evidence to the inquiry was under oath. Has there been any indication that the inquiry feels like it has been lied to, and therefore this oath has been breached? There might need to be further pursuit of that.
I'm not going to use the word lies. It's possible for people to give answers that are incorrect, even if they believe them. There are a number of occasions within this report where the inquiry did not accept the evidence that was given to them by some of the witnesses that appeared before them.
What does that mean?
It means that the inquiry did not accept the explanations that were sometimes given to explain the lack of passing on of important information to higher levels in the military and ministers.
Did that include Jim Blackwell?
Mr. Blackwell's evidence was not all accepted.
Is there a larger problem in government here that GCSB and NZSIS, according to the other report that was released, had information about civilian casualties, and according to it, they could have done more to proactively make sure that ministers were aware of it? There was a second avenue available to the government there. Why didn't that work?
The primary responsibility here lies with the NZDF, as the report by the Inspector General of the IGIS also makes clear. But she does say that given the involvement of security agencies in preparing for the mission, that they could have and perhaps should have, she doesn't quite reach a firm conclusion on this, have done more to alert their minister and other parts of government, if you like, or their hierarchies within the security services as to the existence of reports that suggested there could have been civilian casualties.
How disappointed were you with the treatment of Kari Mirage in terms of, being handed over to the Afghans and later tortured? And will there be any follow-up with regards to that breach of the Geneva Convention?
There will be a follow-up to the issues that are raised. That's quite a complex one for soldiers in theatre. One of the questions that's asked by the inquiry is, when is it fair for New Zealand soldiers assisting another country's military to see themselves as being under the control of that foreign military rather than responsible for what's happening themselves? And the inquiry says that on this occasion, given what was known and given how in effect the New Zealand SAS were in control, even though in a titular sense they thought they were doing it for the Afghan authorities. The inquiry says that in that situation New Zealand can't effectively assume that they are under the control of another country and therefore not responsible for what happens. So that is one of the recommendations that will need to be worked through to make sure that there is clearer guidance to the personnel who represent all of our interests when they're serving New Zealand overseas.
Should the NZDF be handing over detainees to governments where there's considered to be a high risk of torture?
No.
So what's the implication of that finding that there was a breach of the Geneva Convention? What happens after that?
I don't want to make the conclusion that there is a breach of the Geneva Convention here. What happens next is that the New Zealand Defence Force, with advice from the Ministry of Defence, will need to come back to the New Zealand Government and set out what they propose as to, if you like, the rule book in this sort of situation.
But the actual inquiry has, clearly stated that they consider that the handing over of Mirage to the NDS was a breach of the convention, both under Common Article 1.
My understanding is that, well, I'll go back a step. The government accepts that it was inappropriate that Mr. Mirage was tortured, that by the time he did go into that particular facility, there was evidence that should have been known to the New Zealand Defence Force that that facility had a reputation for torturing prisoners, and that as a consequence, Mr. Mirage should not have been handed over and put into that facility, and that the torture that was likely to have occurred of him there was entirely inappropriate. The question as to when it is that New Zealand Defence Forces are acting or have responsibility for their own actions, or are able to rightly say this is someone else's operation and it's not their decision, that is a grey line that needs to be better defined, and that's what the report is saying.
So you're saying that they could get off, basically?
No, I'm not. No, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that the technicalities around that are both contested and difficult, which is not to resile from the proposition that on this occasion, Mr. Kari Mirage should not have been handed over to the Afghan authorities in the knowledge that he was going to a facility that tortured people.
Do you expect that this will harm either the NZDF's or New Zealand's reputation?
I don't think it'll harm New Zealand's reputation, because the quality of this inquiry is so transparently of the highest that I think our partners and the New Zealand public will see that we've got to the bottom of a pretty murky situation. And that sort of transparency, I think, can give the public confidence that in New Zealand, the armed forces are properly within the control of the government, and they're not a law unto themselves.
But it did take a decade to get to this point. So how can people have confidence when it's taken this long to get answers?
Well, as soon as we became government, we set up the inquiry. We did do the right thing. We have done the right thing, and we are the government. So we stand on our record in that regard. I can't answer for people in respect of earlier periods as to why they didn't have an inquiry. You should ask them.
Do you think it'll harm NZDF's reputation?
In the short term, yes, I think this does. New Zealanders, I think, will be shocked at some of the conclusions reached by this report. They should have confidence in the fact that the New Zealand SAS on the ground did the right thing, acted completely lawfully, did nothing that was a revenge attack, acted in accordance with international law and did nothing wrong on the night. So I think that people will have even more confidence in the people that we put in harm's way that do those sorts of things on behalf of us all, but in respect of command structures and transparency through to government, they will have proper questions.
They also failed to investigate the allegations of civilian casualties.
The New Zealand Defence Force, yes, they did, yes. They
So despite the actions on the night being lawful?
I was trying to make the distinction between the soldiers that were there at the night. You know, they were in a very difficult situation. The report concludes that they were right, that there were insurgents in the village. It records that there is evidence of the ferrying of arms, including rocket-propelled grenades, out of houses, and that they were in a threatening situation, and that notwithstanding that threatening situation, they acted entirely appropriate. So that's why I defend the soldiers who were there on the night. They have not done anything wrong.
Those soldiers would have been live to the public discussion that's happened in the years since about what happened on that night, how those allegations were handled subsequently, though. Should they not have spoken up? Was there not an avenue for them to speak up?
Well, they have command structures through which those things are meant to be reported up through those areas. I think some of them probably did speak to Hager and Stevenson. I also know that they felt impugned by the allegations in the Hager and Stevenson book that said that there was no threat to them. They were just innocent villagers on the night in question in the locality. That's one of the reasons why when we announced this inquiry, I said that I didn't accept that this was a benign operation in which they were operating, because I too had seen that footage.
Yeah, but back to the point, should there have been some method for these soldiers that you're claiming to have raised the issue outside of the command structure, which clearly wasn't willing to accommodate for them?
Well, that's one of the ways in which they might be able to do that in the future, is through the Inspector General of Defence. So we need some other mechanism that these things can be investigated and brought to light. I would have thought if we had the Inspector General of Defence in existence during this event, the Inspector General would have looked into it, him or herself, earlier, and could have spoken to the soldiers that were there on the night. So that would be an avenue.
Soldiers are trained not to respect unlawful orders and not to follow chain of command when a chain of command might be telling them to break the law. It's not clear here that any laws were broken, but should there be more training that they should also be told to blow the whistle in a way if after the fact the chain of command seems to be misrepresenting what they did?
Well, again, I think that the Inspector General of Defence route is probably the way in which that sort of thing would be best dealt with.
Just quickly again, on the, do you have any information that would indicate that there will be like subsequent action taken against anyone who was involved in the inquiry, be it by complaints, prosecution, anything like that? Do you have any information?
No, I don't. No, we received this report 2 weeks ago. Consequences for individuals as to what is documented in the inquiry aren't for the inquiry, nor are they for me, but they will be issues which the New Zealand Defence Force will, I expect, be considering themselves.
Do you think this raises concerns about other New Zealand Defence Force operations overseas?
No, I don't. I haven't seen things that give me the same level of concern as that we had here. Right, thank you.